just a little background on what COP is about. So COP stands for the Conference of Parties, and parties are actually countries who are signatory to the international treaties or conventions. So in this regard, we are referring to COP, UNFCCC COP, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The 27th Assembly that occurred since 1995, where countries come together, negotiate, and strengthen their global response to climate change. So COP27 was an African COP. It was held in Egypt, in the city of Sharm el-Sheikh, from the 6th to the 18th of November, although it stretched a little bit longer for discussions and outcomes of its proceedings to be actually shared with the global world. So Namibia is a signatory to the COP, or to the UNFCCC convention, and of course has been part of the COP proceedings. And this year it observed a greater number of delegations compared to previous representation and also just participation. So again, welcome me to introduce you guys to the panelists that we have here, making up of the Namibian delegation that was part of the proceedings, as well as following other various discussions, negotiations at COP as they reflect on their engagements, share a few successes, as well as Namibia's positions at COP27. So here with me today, or with us, is Bernadette Shalumbu-Shivute. She's the manager for programs and programming at the Environmental Investment Fund of Namibia. And then we also have Madam Carol Mwape, who is the Commonwealth National Climate Finance Advisor for Namibia, sitting in the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Tourism. Also, we have a representative from civil society, Ms. Mirja Stoldt, who's the Senior Project Coordinator from the Namibia Nature Foundation. And then lastly, Ms. Louise Brown, who's the Director for Triple Capital. So a warm welcome to our panelists. Okay, thank you so much, our participants as well, for coming in and having your audios muted. As we proceed, I think we can as well just kick off with our first question. Of course, directed to Bernadette. So Bernadette, you organized, supervised, and also facilitated Namibia's first ever activities at the Namibian Pavilion at COP27. And maybe just to highlight that was Namibia's first pavilion at COP. So we just actually wanted to reflect from your own reflection, what was Namibia seeking from its engagement at COP27 now, and what did it achieve? Please take on the podium, or the platform, sorry, Bernadette.
All right. Thank you so much, Toini. Thank you to the organizers for wanting us to continue working even well into the festive season. Thank you to the online participants for really being keen to sit in and listen to what transpired at the COP. Yes, Toini, back to your question. So when Namibia decided to engage at COP this year, it was primarily twofold. The one is that we are signatory to the convention, and there's an obligation from all parties that we should report back on the progress. This is progress towards the attainment of the Paris Agreement goals. And this we do mostly through our NDC targets, or report back on those targets. And the other was also to negotiate the items that Namibia was advocating for, because the delegation does also comprise of negotiators. I'll touch briefly based on the negotiations, and then I'll come back to the pavilion just a bit later. So in terms of the negotiations, there were a few items that the country was advocating for. I think key to this was the issue on finance. Of course, we understand that without finance, we cannot achieve much of the targets that we have set out for ourselves. So really, we were advocating for scaling up of some of these climate finance by the big funders out there. There were targets or negotiating items on mitigation, urging countries to submit more ambitious NDCs, to adopt ambitious deadline for meeting the net zero emission targets. There were negotiating items related to technology transfer. How do we accelerate transfer of such technologies to countries like Namibia? How do we create networks where this information can be disseminated and these technologies can be employed? And then also items related to reduce emissions from deforestation and degradation. Of course, Namibia does have a target in its NDC to reforest some of its land. So some of the negotiators were actively following those agenda items. Of course, key adaptation, very important for our country. So Namibia was just urging parties to develop a global goal for adaptation, and that the finances coming to the country or being availed for adaptation and mitigation be split equally, because currently now there's more money being given to mitigation versus adaptation. Then transparency and carbon markets were the other two that the people were also like participating in the negotiations. And most importantly, there was an item on loss and damage when Namibia was negotiating for the full operationalization of the Santiago network on loss and damage, and also to establish a loss and damage fund. And this is one key outcome that then transpired at the end of COP, this loss and damage fund. So on the pavilion, really we had just the following objectives. You mentioned this was like the first time we were doing this, but really wanted to showcase our country's achievement to date as how we contribute towards the attainment of the Paris Agreement goals. We also wanted to use it as an opportunity to increase investment towards different programs and projects geared towards the attainment of the NDC targets, and also to provide a network for our delegation to network with others and to also allow other organizations to also participate on activities at our pavilion. So that's it, Toini. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bernadette. I think Namibia has somehow reached its target when it comes to, or when it came to increase investments or just providing that platform, because I believe there was some climate finance secured. Maybe just a little bit in depth of that, Bernadette.
All right. I don't have the figures with me, so I will not be speaking specifically to the figures, but what I can say is that most of the agreements that were signed were mostly geared to support Namibia's transition towards the whole green hydrogen program that's being spearheaded under the Office of the President. So agreements were signed with the EU. There were some others with the European Union, Invest International, and others that I forgot about. But really, like most of the investments or it was geared towards green hydrogen.
Awesome. Thank you, Bernadette, for those reflections. We'll come back to you. But now we would like to go to Madam Carol Mwape. Madam Carol Mwape, actually, amongst other responsibilities, I know COP comes with a lot of responsibilities. You were following negotiations under the African Group of Negotiators. And of course, COP27 was meant to be an implementation COP. To considerable upscale climate actions and all the others. So maybe just a reflection on what were Africa's aims from the negotiations and what did it achieve?
Thank you very much, Toini, and collectively everyone who's here for sparing time, I think, to keep the momentum of COP27 and also keeping in mind that we have as a country, the national determined contribution that needs to be implemented. And this is the point of view from which the Africa Group of Negotiators is coming from. And maybe for the sake of those that are joining us on this webinar, is maybe to first, let me just present what Africa's principles of negotiating are, because sometimes there are cases where they say, oh, Africa is blocking the negotiations, they are dragging feet. But to point out that as one of the principles of African Group of Negotiators is to commit to the multilateral approach to the approach of addressing the global challenge of climate change within the multilateral process of the UNFCCC. And this has been upheld from the first COP when the AGN was formed, the Africa Group of Negotiators. But Africa also highlights in all its negotiations the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, but also tries to re-emphasize that we have developed countries that have a historical responsibility to address greenhouse gas emissions and to provide leadership in addressing those emissions. Also coming from the point of view, Africa acknowledges that while the continent is still developing, the emissions coming from the region is steadily increasing. I think historically we were at 0.5% in terms of global contributions to the emissions, but now we've steadily reached 4%, where we are talking about Africa's contribution to the global emissions. So this is just to give an impression of where Africa is coming from when we go to the COP and when we went to COP27, and also to emphasize that as we negotiate as Africa, as a region, we emphasize that whatever measures are being taken by the global community within the context of the UNFCCC process, this should not result into negative implications on Africa's trade, and also not to create trade barriers for for Africa's access to export markets. So these are just a few of the principles that Africa uses when we are negotiating with our partners from the global north. But in terms of COP27, there were quite a number of priorities that Africa had set, and these priorities were not just set by a handful of negotiators. The Africa group of negotiators actually had to seek leadership and guidance from the Africa Union, and also from the Africa Ministerial Conference on Environment. And so this had a lot of political support and political will in terms of leadership from the African group of negotiators. I'll just highlight a few of the priorities because, as you know, COP had such a long agenda, and we can't exhaust everything in this forum, but of priority, one was that Africa was looking forward to the global community arriving at an increased ambition on mitigation. As you know, the IPCC 60th assessment report has indicated that the current ambition that we have is not putting us on the right pathway to maintaining the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature. So Africa was looking forward to countries that have provided nationally determined contributions, at least to indicate an increase in the targets, especially from countries that have high emissions. Alongside that, Africa was looking forward to increased long-term finance. And this is in the context of providing support in the context of Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, which indicates that finance flows have to be consistent with what is required for us to achieve low emission pathways. But also Article 9.3 of the Paris Agreement indicates that countries, especially developed countries, need to up their provision of finance by also looking at the variety of sources, including private sector and multilateral development banks. And so Africa was looking at having an increase in pledges and also in commitments to providing climate finance for the period that we are in up to 2025. As you know, most countries have now revised their NDCs up to 2025. And so climate finance actually becomes a critical ingredient to us being able to implement and meeting the ambition. At Glasgow, we had the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh Work Program on the Global Goal for Adaptation. And because, like you have said, Toini, that Sharm el-Sheikh was being considered as an implementation COP, we wanted as Africa to see that decisions that had come from Glasgow received decisions in Sharm el-Sheikh that were actionable, or at least decisions that could create mechanisms or frameworks of how to operationalize these decisions that were coming from previous COPs. So this work program on the Global Goal for Adaptation, for Africa, what we wanted to see was establishing a framework of how to operationalize the Global Goal on Adaptation. As you know, Currently, we don't have a quantifiable goal. So countries are at a loss to measure adaptation, whether we are achieving anything. So we needed to have even guidance to arrive at a decision for defining what is this global goal on adaptation, and look at a decision seeking for the subsidiary body, for example, for technology and scientific advice, to guide us on elaborating targets and indicators on adaptation and what would be the needs and costs that would be required. This would serve as benchmarks because achieving a goal, you need to have benchmarks against which you implement. The other priority for Africa that we had put across was that we were looking forward for facilitation of provision of enhanced and scaled up predictable financial and technology support for implementation of NAPs. In Africa alone, we have about 15 countries that have already prepared their national adaptation plans, but these NAPs are still seeking financing. And so at COP27, we wanted to see deliberate action or decisions from the parties to drive at the funding mechanisms to provide dedicated financing to implementation of NAPs. My colleague Bernadette has just touched on the Santiago Network on loss and damage. That was established in Madrid at COP25. And so as an implementation COP at Sharm el-Sheikh, we were actually pushing to see that the Santiago Network on loss and damage be concluded by putting in place institutional structures, funding arrangements on loss and damage so that this subject could at least make progress. I'll just speak to one of the other priorities, which is the Glasgow Dialogue, which also touched on the need for parties to dialogue on how we were going to progress on loss and damage. And this was emanating from the Glasgow COP, COP26. So as you see, we had quite a number of decisions that had come from previous COPs, including from Madrid, some from Warsaw, that had not been receiving action decisions. And so at COP27, Africa was looking forward to getting decisions that could put these previous decisions in action. So these are some of the priorities. I don't know if at this moment I should still touch on the achievements of what came out from COP27, or I can come later. Toini, should I touch on what Africa achievements were?
I think yes. Maybe I'll give you 2 minutes to just maybe round up on that, and then we can go to the next panelist.
Yeah. So as a continent, Africa was looking to a collective implementation package, and it's good that we saw now what came out is being called Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Plan, which has got, I think, more than 15 outcomes that are packaged there. But of importance, I think, is that we have the commitment to establish the funding arrangements for loss and damage. It was a big outcome for all, for Africa especially, and for small developing countries like island states. But I think we need to have more discussions coming along in the coming COPs to look at how do we continue to push for enhanced climate finance, but also modalities of how is capacity building technology transfer are going to be delivered. We didn't have much outcome on the increased ambition, unfortunately, apart from parties recognizing that the ambition that has been set is still below par. So these are some of the areas that have continued to remain as gaps. So I'll stop here, but I think in the interactions that we'll have, I can elaborate more on the context of the Africa Group of Negotiators. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol. I think what you shared was really rich. As Africa, we are celebrating the fund on loss and damage that was established at COP. And I think that is one of the major highlights that will keep us smiling until COP28. Although we have many, many other achievements and outcomes we're looking forward to. So our next panel will be, panelist and speaker will be Louise Brown, who will be giving more reflections on climate finance. So Louise, you followed most of, or let me say, discussions on climate finance. So would like to hear from you, what were some of the key outcomes and why are they or those relevant to Namibia?
Thank you very much, Toini, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us so late in the year. So as both Carol and Bernadette mentioned, finance was a very critical issue for Namibia and for African countries in general. And going into the negotiations, there was already an atmosphere of some tension and distrust between developed and developing countries because of the failure of developed countries to meet their climate finance commitments to date. So in 2009, at the Copenhagen COP, developed countries made a commitment to provide 100 billion in climate financing for developing countries, starting from 2020 and every year thereon, with a goal to increase that number from the year 2025 onwards. But what we've seen to date is that developed countries have not met that 100 billion climate finance commitment. The estimates of finance flows are quite varied, but the highest is around 80 billion. So they're still falling quite short of meeting that commitment. And that has created this atmosphere of distrust. So one of the issues in the negotiations has also been the negotiation of the new collective quantified goal, which will take over from that 100 billion goal from 2025. But those discussions are also, suffering from some challenges because of this failure of developed countries to meet the goals that they have already set. So there's a perception that how can we set a new goal if they haven't even met the old goal? And that existing goal of 100 billion is still a relatively symbolic amount if we take it within the context of what is actually needed. So developing countries are calling for the next goal to be based on the actual climate finance needs of developing countries, which are in the range of trillions rather than billions. But of course, developed countries are pushing back. So the discussions around setting a new goal were not expected to conclude at Sharm el-Sheikh. It's an ongoing dialogue, and there's a series of technical dialogues that will take place over the next few years with the aim of reaching agreement by 2024 in advance of when that goal would come into implementation. Another area that was very prominent in the discussions at Sharm el-Sheikh, both within the negotiations, but possibly even more outside of the negotiations, was the recognition of the need to reform the international financial system. And this has been quite an important outcome of the Sharm el-Sheikh dialogue because it is reflected in the decision text of the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan, even though it doesn't have a very clear home within the negotiations in terms of how it will be taken forward. But the fact that it's recognized in the text is an important first step. And the reason that this is important is because, as Carol mentioned, one of the key goals of the Paris Agreement is to align finance with a pathway towards low carbon and climate resilient development. But if you look at how the current financial system is structured, what you see is that the overall amount of finance that's going into climate-related investments, which is in the region of about 800 billion per year, including private sector flows, is a very, very tiny piece of the overall financial system. And in fact, globally, countries are still putting more funding into fossil fuels and fossil fuel subsidies than they are into climate change. So if we want to really shift that situation and see more funding going into climate change and really aligning the financial system with the Paris Agreement, then some very fundamental shifts will need to take place. So that recognition was a first for the COP process, and it's quite an important first step, although it's still more work will of course need to be done to turn that into implementation. The text also recognizes the need to reform the multilateral financial institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the African Development Bank, and so on. And that's another very important recognition, because these institutions are, financial powerhouses. They have a development mandate, and they are backed by governments, and in particular developed country governments. So they're financially institutions that can take on risk and that can have the potential to be very catalytic in shifting global investment towards more climate compatible investment. But currently, they are not really taking on the level of risk that they need to in order to enable that shift to happen. So the call for reform of multilateral development banks is another area that has the potential to be very transformational, but the challenge that lies ahead will be to actually implement it. And hopefully that will be taken up under the dialogue on Article 2.1c, which is what, as Carol mentioned, about aligning finance with the Paris Agreement. The one other thing that I would mention that came out on finance, which was sort of on the sidelines of the negotiations, but it did get a mention within the text, was the UN Secretary General had appointed a high-level expert group to come up with a set of recommendations on how non-state actors, such as financial institutions and businesses and cities and regions, can take action to achieve net zero. Because what we've seen in the past is this proliferation of net zero targets by non-state actors, but there have been a lot of accusations of greenwashing and of targets that aren't actually going to be met and that are just for marketing purposes. So this report by this high-level expert group was released at COP, and it sets out some very clear recommendations that can help to bring the non-governmental actors into the fold to be important contributors of finance towards climate change. So that was another important outcome. And I'll stop there, Toini. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Louise. That was also very much rich, especially from the climate finance desk, and also learning about the non-state actors, owning up and also just coming on board and supporting with climate finance. So I think that was a really, really important highlight. And I'm sure that non-state actors have taken notice of that, and maybe to also appear in further discussions at COP28 and going forward. So thank you so much. I know some of your reflections are also outlined on the article that you published called COP27, a multilateral COP out, and it's found on Triple Capital's website. So for those that also just want to get to understand more about the climate finance can actually visit that. Now we go to civil society. Ms. Mirja, as a representative of civil society, and mostly people complain that they are mostly observers, but in this regard, perhaps you got more of like the inside as a Namibian delegation and delegate and party. But would like to know on the reflection of like, because civil societies often have these considerable expectations at COPs. So what are some of the CSO's demands, or what were some of those demands that CSOs have risen or have raised at COP, and were they met actually?
Thank you so much, Toini, and thank you everyone for joining. As already mentioned, this late in December, and I know there's a lot of workshops and meetings going on, and everybody's stretching between all of them. So thanks a lot for joining. Yes, I think I personally feel civil society plays a very strong advocacy role, and I think many of them are raising a lot of awareness They're very well organized. They have very well written positions that really give you a very good background as well. And if you sort of wander around COP, you'll find quite a lot of them. And of course, there are also very different groups. You've got sort of groups that are more focused on women empowerment. You've got groups that are more focused on nature. You've got very adaptation focused groups. So there's, of course, a very wide range of demands. So I'll just go into a few of them. And there's, of course, also quite a bit of an overlap with what some of the others already mentioned. So I think one of the major demands was this general need to upscale and deliver on climate finance. Louise did mention that there's a target of 100 billion. Yes. And that this hasn't been delivered on. And I think something that is strongly pushed by the civil society side is that a lot of this finance is not reaching the right people. It's not reaching the lowest possible level. It's not reaching local communities. It's not reaching the people who are the most vulnerable. And I think, especially during sort of the side events, you had a lot of discussions on locally led adaptation and how do you ensure that more finance reaches these local levels, because I think on the adaptation side, it's only about 10% of global adaptation finance that reaches subnational levels, and the most vulnerable that they benefit to claim with a lot of these projects. Something that was already mentioned by quite a few others was also the loss and damage fund. And I think that goes very much in line with having more climate finance for the local level and actually supporting communities that are affected by climate disasters. Another key thing that was pushed was on sort of the fossil fuel side. As Louise mentioned, there's still considerably more investment going into fossil fuels than into climate change. And there's been a lot of movement, especially now with the energy crisis in Europe due to the Ukraine-Russia war, to declare atomic energy green or to declare gas as a transition fuel. And I think there was quite a bit of push in that direction to really make sure that you transform the energy system away from fossil fuels and not have these sort of transition fuels that a lot of people are using. I think another thing was actually keeping the 1.5 target alive. There has been some movements of going rather targeting the 2 degrees, which would of course have less of a sense of urgency attached to it. So there was quite a bit of keeping that target alive to be more ambitious and to be more ambitious in reducing global emissions. And I think something that was also pushed by some groups was to have more of a nature focus and to make sure that biodiversity, land degradation and climate change targets are integrated, that we don't just invest and focus on technological solutions and transformation of energy systems and infrastructure and industry, which is of course necessary, but at the same time, doesn't make sense if you destroy your carbon sinks and if you destroy the last bit of nature you have that could help you out of this crisis. I think in terms of some highlights, so some of these demands that were managed or were addressed to some extent was the loss and damage fund that was created, which will of course now lead to quite a long process to actually establish it and define criteria for access. So I think it will still become quite a long process until there's actually funding flowing through this new fund. There was also, surprisingly for the first time, a lot of words such as food security, rivers, nature-based solutions, ecological tipping points, these kind of things were actually included in the cover decision or in the cover letter of this COP, which was something that was quite new and picked up a lot of more of these voices that wanted more integration between biodiversity or ecosystem related issues and climate change. And then, as Louise mentioned, of course, this transformation of the financial mechanisms to make sure that more climate finance reaches developing countries. I would consider sort of some of the major letdowns is firstly sort of there was no winding down of fossil fuels whatsoever, although there seemed to have been a very strong backing by a lot of countries. I think at least 80 countries sort of started voicing towards we need to phase out fossil fuels. But it seemed that this was something that was strongly blocked by the COP presidency. So it wasn't something that was picked up. And I think for a lot of civil society organizations, that was very disappointing to not have a more clearer stance on sort of transitioning away from fossil fuels. I think they also really struggled to keep this 1.5 goal alive. There were many discussions about changing it, perhaps looking at 2 degrees now. So I think there's still not enough urgency. And I think especially sort of the mitigation ambition and the mitigation program were areas that weren't pushed to the extent that they should have. And then, I mean, it was my first COP. Very interesting experience. But what I heard from a lot of other people is that generally this year, the whole process was a lot less transparent and inclusive. And a lot of decisions and also the cover letters and so on, they were circulated very, very late. It didn't give people adequate time to actually reflect on what is in there, perhaps consult some advisors, which could also include civil society. And often a lot of these texts were formulated by a very, very small group. And I think that's something that's also concerning, because that, of course, also limits the extent to which you can include other views of practitioners and experts in the field. So I think those would be sort of the core ones from my side, and I give back to Toini. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mirja. I feel like civil society always have this cool way of reporting back, because they can touch on anything. Even if it's a good achievement, they can actually take out some key areas or just source out something and really just say, no, this is not exactly how we wanted it. Although the state actors may feel like it's really a great achievement, but from civil society side, it's always facts, 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 and that's exactly how it is. So thank you so much, Mirja, for those reflections. Now I just want to open up the platform for any questions for our panelists, maybe from our audiences. I myself have a question for the panelists. But I would like to give the platform first to our participants. So please feel free. You can chat your question or put your question in the chat box, or you can also just ask to unmute yourself and then raise your question. So thank you so much. Okay, maybe while we are waiting for any questions from our panelists, I don't see a hand. I don't see anything in the chat. Perhaps I had a question for Mirja. I think I'll start with Mirja, sorry. I wanted to hear more on, because there was civil societies that were going on about the ocean, or actually the ocean, something about the ocean negotiations coming on first, also at COP, and something having been signed over there. And I cannot really reflect, but maybe just, some insights on that, about how the ocean ecosystem was recognized at COP27.
That is a very specific question. I actually didn't follow the ocean negotiations. I had a few chats to some other organizations, especially from Southern Africa, that tend to be more ocean focused. And I think what was mentioned from their side is that there's not enough recognition of the importance of oceans. And I think something that has popped up over the years is to discuss more about the blue economy and how it can be more sustainable, how you can sort of change shipping systems. But sort of the person I talked to said, I was struggling to find, events that I could go to or events that I could listen to. So considering that oceans are our biggest carbon sinks, there's often there's a lack of acknowledgement of the importance of oceans. And sort of walking around COP, yes, it was very difficult to find marine or ocean-related side events or pavilions and the like. And I think this is also something, if you start looking at, for example, the NDCs of countries, I think that shows. There's often very little ambition in sort of the ocean-related indicators on both the mitigation and the adaptation side. And I hope that sort of in the future, there will also be oceans in the cover letter, but at least we've got rivers there now and nature-based solutions. So there's always more to push for.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mirja, for that reflection. I actually just wanted to know what was actually so exciting about the ocean ecosystem being part of COP27. But it's so sad that there wasn't really much of the events going on. And we actually hope that in future COPs, this could be something that can be recognized, and engagements of such nature can be integrated into COP activities. Maybe from our end as well, we don't know. We have an ocean, right? All right. Any questions from our participants? All right. So we are still within time. Again, if you have any question, just put it in the chat box. We'll reflect on it later. But maybe just for the last questions for our panelists, I think we still have more than enough time to engage before we close the session. So I'll just like to ask a question, and I think we can start with a reshuffle. I think Ms. Carol can help us, like open up this question, where we just want to know where are we going from here, and what other reflections have you maybe left out of these discussions that you would like to reflect on?
Thank you, Toini. Maybe before I go into my final reflections, just to pick up on where Mirja left on the oceans, the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan has actually included not so strong an outcome on the oceans, and I think it was more of the COP encouraging parties to consider including ocean-based actions in their national climate goals, particularly in the NDCs, long-term strategies and NAPs. And so I think there was a bit of movement there, and maybe picking up from there, it gives us room that in the following COPs, we can have more, contact groups being convened by the presidency to specifically explore some of these sectors that are lagging behind. And in similar manner, I think when you talk about the oceans, Bernadette and I are always saying health has been lagging behind. It's one sector that you barely hear in the negotiations. I think maybe the complexity of how to link health and climate change still remains unclear. But I think we made a little movement in that context. From my perspective of the outcomes of COP and where we go from here, Louise touched on the loss and damage funding arrangements that have been established, where we still need to elaborate in terms of how is this going to be, made operational. So most likely because parties just came out from a process of establishing the Green Climate Fund, there are indications that the loss and damage fund establishment may take a similar route. And for GCF, it took about a full year to put in place. And so we are hoping that by COP28, we can set in motion establishment or creation of a transitional committee or other structure to spearhead establishing of this fund, because the loss and damage finance is needed like yesterday, and small island states, for example, are in dire need of this financing. But also, I think in the context of what has been discussed a lot on the global transition to low emission, despite there being an outcome encouraging developed countries to accelerate the development, deployment, and dissemination of technology and adoption of policies to transition towards low emission energy systems, the how part and also the means of implementation still remains unclear. So countries are being urged to transition from this to that, but still that calls for provision of financing. If, for example, from the African perspective, you find that the African continent is the least connected to electricity. So they're still exploring whatever energy options that are available to try and connect their population and also to accelerate their economic development. So this is, in my understanding or perspective, could have been why at COP27 the presidency didn't push so much on this, knowing that from the African point of view, there's still a lot of hesitation as to how do we transition when we haven't even gotten there. So I think there'll still be need to have a very open and objective discussion as we proceed to COP28, both within the country, but also in the region as Africa, to see how do we address the global transition to better energy systems. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you so much, Carol. I think we got some few questions in the chat now, and because the one question is actually a reflection on all panelists. In terms, it's coming from Betha, and she's like, "What are the panelists' view on the upcoming year and the next COP? Maybe focusing on what we can expect from the loss and damage fund discussion, and also from the push to include phasing down or out of fossil fuel." So I think while you are reflecting on your going forward on COP27, which I think, going forward for the next COPs, I think maybe you can also give your reflection and answer to Betha's question. And I think I will open up the session to Bernadette. And then after that, we can then touch on the last question that came from Emily, if we still have enough time. So Bernadette, please.
All right, thank you, Toini. Thank you, Bertha. I mean, for me, really going forward, what I'd like to see at the next COP is that there's more action and less talk. I mean, this previous COP did exceed the time that was allocated to it, with some of the key outcomes only being negotiated or being communicated rather when people had even gone back to their home countries. We know that these conferences have been taking place for some time now. This is the 28th COP that people are attending, and countries have been living with the impacts of climate change. Every year you hear of a different disaster, one or another country being impacted. And in my opinion, I think that, like the COPs are more focused on just agreeing or disagreeing on text, and we are forgetting like really the urgency at hand, which is the loss of human life, loss of livelihoods, habitat, whatever you have. So for me, I'm reflecting and asking myself, do we really have to meet every year, given that it feels like we are just going around in circles, just talking? Or can we really rethink the frequency of these meetings and really what we want at the end of it? For countries like Namibia, we are really coming to the table. We are submitting what we need to do in terms of the requirements from the convention, but you have a feeling that you are not being met halfway. So really, can we rethink the strategy moving forward into the next negotiations? I would end it for there. I don't have an opinion on the fossil fuel scaling down or reducing fossil fuels, but perhaps the other panelists can touch on that.
Thank you so much, Bernadette. Louise, and maybe also your reflection on Betha's question.
Thank you very much, Toini. I think one of the things that was remarkable at this COP that just ended, for me, was the role that some of the smaller, vulnerable countries played, the leadership role. And if we look at the outcomes of the COP, some of the key things that came out, like the loss and damage fund and the push for reform of the financial system architecture and the reform of the multilateral development banks, these are issues that were primarily pushed by some of the most vulnerable and the least economically powerful countries in the world. The push for the reform of the multilateral development banks, for example, came from Barbados. The Prime Minister of Barbados was very outspoken on this issue, and then she brought some other countries to join her. And also the issue of the loss and damage fund, that was really strongly pushed by the vulnerable countries like the Caribbean islands, the Pacific islands, some of the LDCs in Africa and Asia. And so for me, what that highlights is that small countries can have a disproportionate impact in this process if they organize themselves well and come together collectively to push for their collective interests and come with a very strong strategy. So I think for me, moving forward, that is one of the key takeaways, is that as vulnerable countries, we need to be very strategic and very coordinated to push for what we for what we want. And in the design of this loss and damage fund, as Mirja said, it's going to be a long process, but it will be very important to, first of all, make sure that we get commitments of funding for it, because right now it's an empty fund or almost an empty fund. But secondly, to make sure that the design is really geared towards the needs of vulnerable countries, and it doesn't become another big bureaucratic fund that's difficult for countries to access. I think the other thing that I would mention around the fossil fuels, scaling down fossil fuels, I think that this issue is very tied to the finance, because as Carol mentioned, for African countries and other developing countries that still have major energy access issues, the transition to moving away from fossil fuels is tied to the need for financial support to enable that transition. So those two issues go hand in hand, and we need to see, as Bernadette said, we need to see those developed countries meeting us halfway. If we are to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, they also need to come with the finance so that that can be enabled. And there's a question on the funding for vulnerable countries reaching the local level. I mean, I think that that's an issue that is getting a lot more attention. Recently, there's been a set of principles for locally led adaptation that were agreed and have been adopted by a lot of institutions, but there's still a long way to go to really make sure the funding reaches the local level. And that's very critical, because especially for adaptation, that response to building resilience to climate change really has to happen at the local level. That's where people are most affected. And of course, climate change disproportionately affects those that are most vulnerable. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise, and for integrating the last question from Emily in your response and your reflections. Now, to Mirja, maybe also just a reflection on going forward. What do you think next COP should focus on, and any other reflections that you have left, while also touching a little bit on Betha's question, and maybe if you have a little bit contribution on Emily's. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think I'll focus on the two questions, because what I wanted to say is very much aligned to Louise, which is we need to make sure that we use the lessons we've learned in our country and aggregate them in a better way to push for some of the things that we would like to see more as part of the negotiations. I think in terms of fossil fuel transitions, it will be very, very interesting, because I think where a lot of this is currently the deadlock is exactly what Louise said. You've got a lot of European countries who are currently struggling with the Ukraine and Russian war, and they are going back on exactly these demands that they like to hold developing countries to. So you're having a lot of developed countries now pushing for saying atomic energy is green and gas is a good transitional fuel. So you've got a lot of the developed countries going back on sort of committing to transitioning energy systems, but at the same time pushing developing countries to increase their ambitions and their commitments. So I think it's a very interesting space that will probably come up a lot during the negotiations in the next year. I think for having a more ambitious target towards phasing out fossil fuel, you might not have the right COP presidency. So I don't think sort of with the next COP being hosted in the United Arab Emirates, I don't think there will be a lot of movement on this, to be very honest. So it will be interesting what happens, but I think sort of these geopolitical discussions that are currently being held, especially at sort of a European level, and not just European level, but I think with the current cap on sort of the prices of gas and those kind of things, there's going to be a lot of movement in these discussions in the next year. So I think it will be a very interesting space to follow, but at the same time, I don't see huge moves in that direction. I think on the more finance reaching the local level, it is something that's very hot on the agenda, and I think it's something that probably a lot of people will push more as you talk about this transformation of the financial system and financial mechanisms. I think this is hopefully something that we can bring up more. There have been some things in the past. So there have been sort of enhanced direct access project or programs by both the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund. And we actually have one of those in Namibia. So there's probably a considerable scope to look at some of the lessons learned from these and just look at what works and what are the kind of things that we can implement to ensure more finance reaches the local level. And that, of course, will also require a lot more partnerships. And I think that's something that came out very clearly at COP as well, that nobody knows everything. And in order to have more transformational projects, you need to team up with different institutions from different sectors. And for example, private sector and civil society need to team up to make sure that you've got sort of this local perspective and the local impact, but at the same time crowd in the catalytic finance that you would need. So I think there's a lot more that can be done in that space. And I hope that sort of with the attention it got during this COP, that there will be considerable movement as part of this transformation of the financial system.
Awesome. I'm afraid, I mean, it's been an hour already and we're almost to conclude or are to conclude our session, which was very, very interesting. And I hope our participant had the same reflection and feeling about this webinar. I think we were supposed to continue like for 2 hours or so because the discussions were just about to pick up and getting interesting and, you know, man. But anyways, thank you so much to our panelists. We can never really thank you enough. Thank you so much for reflecting on your experiences as well as Namibia's position at COP27 and as well as you guys preparing now for COP28. We wish you all the best. I know it's too early to give that kind of remarks, but really, I think you need it as well. And maybe we want to see the oceans also becoming or reflected on COP28 activities. And maybe if Namibia is going to host a pavilion at COP28, maybe those could be some of the key activities that you can target to include at your pavilions. So thank you so much to our panelists. A very warm thank you as well to our participants who have taken our time and to be with us during these proceedings. And I hope the reflections were a lesson learned to you and they have actually also just impacted you in taking action as well as just being part of the negotiations and following COP outcomes and discussions. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Have a nice day.
Bye.
Oh,
Bye.
and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. We're starting with that.
Yes.
Compliments of the season.
Jolly happy.
Bye.
Thank you all for the
Bye.
session.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.